New Zealanders are proud of their number 8 wire mentality, but not much has been mentioned about our copper wire ingenuity. What many people don't realise is that, as a country, we ran with the pack or even led it in an important industry, electricity. David Reeve and myself, Stephen Batstone, have worked in New Zealand's energy sector for more years than we admit to. And over the years, we've become enlightened to a bunch of characters from our past, which we feel deserve recognition for the part they played in the history of New Zealand's energy sector.
Steve and I have been mates for 14 years. We both work in the electricity sector, Steve for about 14 years when he finally finished mucking about at Canterbury University, and me for a bit longer. Okay, a lot longer. We work in the floopy inner workings of the industry, which is all a bit mysterious like electricity itself. But we're going to try to unravel some of the electricery to show you just what amazing things these guys did. Without their ingenuity, guts and sheer determination, New Zealand might not be quite as well powered as it is today. We've created what we're calling our Powerboard of Fame, and between us we have a list of men, and they are all men, sorry ladies, that we think belong on it. And earlier this year we went on a bit of a tour of some of the sites around New Zealand to learn more about these incredible men, so we'll throw in some of our travels in there as well. Steve, have you got your list?
Got it.
Cool, let's get into it.
Now I'm going to start at what I think is the very start, with a guy called George Bullen. Now he and his brother Charles emigrated from the UK here in the 1850s chasing gold. Now they started to make some money by packing supplies into the gold fields, but then they started to buy up land in southern Otago. Around the 1860s, George Bullen became the sole owner of the Phoenix Gold Mine, in a place then known as the Reefs, way up Skipper's Canyon near Queenstown. Now to understand the marriage of hydropower and gold, we have to take a bit of a closer look at how gold was mined in those days. On our travels we came across some great characters, and one of them was Jimmy Foster from Reefton, an ex-coal miner.
It was hard work, you know. I'm a coal miner by trade, and my work when I started off was extremely hard as well, and I started off as a hand miner. Quartz dust, you can breathe in and you can't breathe out. Coal dust, you can breathe in, it'll get caught, and you can cough it, you can get most of that coal dust out, so it's not as bad. In the School of Mines over here, there's a man's lung that is just about a solid hunk of quartz, and I think he was 27 years old when he died. So the life expectancy of a quartz miner wasn't high.
Now the energy-hungry part of gold mining was a thing called a stamping battery. To understand a bit more about how these things worked, we spoke to Peter Lawn at Blacks Point Museum in Reefton.
Welcome to Blacks Point.
Hello
Peter,
how are you? Good to meet you.
I'm Stephen.
Good on you, Stephen. Come in.
Thank you.
So Peter, this is a model of a gold mine. Talk us through what's going on in the mine.
This is a model of the deepest gold mine here, the Waiuta gold mine or Blackwater gold mine. And so the big seam or reef is diving away like this. And this is the top of the ground here. So what you needed to do is put a big shaft down onto your reef, drilled and blast their way down, and then hit the reef, and you put your poppet head for carrying the cages below the surface, bring the ore up, and you drilled across the reef, drilling and blasting until you got chunks of rock this size here.
So this is the size of quartz that came out of the mine.
That's the one to be taken away to be crushed.
Okay, so this needed to be crushed down to get the gold out. How did the crushing happen?
So this is where the stamper battery comes in.
Talk me through it.
Okay, so the ores come out of the mine and is brought to the hopper at the top, and that's fed down into the stamper, the 5 stamps here, the big weights on the bottom there, and that's run by a little bar that goes up the side of the stamp. The weight hits on that, turns the disc, the ore's sitting on it, drops it into the stamper box, crushing it up fine. It can't come out unless it fits through a very, very fine mesh on the front. Water's flowing out there all the time, so the water brings it all out. So when it comes through there, a lot of gold is actually released from the rock, so small, the liquid mercury polished on the plate to catch the gold as an amalgam.
So how was this whole thing driven, Peter?
The water drove the water wheel, so the water coming down the pipeline, turning on the valve here, shooting in and hitting the little containers here, spinning the water wheel around, driving the cams here, lifting the stampers up, and away it goes.
So I guess it was really important that the whole operation was near a good water supply.
Absolutely, and you need a fall as well to come down to create that pressure to spin the wheel.
This is amazing. Now, wouldn't it be brilliant if you actually had an operating one of these?
You guessed it, Peter could go one better than the model.
Now, I'm going to be really interested to see what's in here.
You'll get a great surprise. So here we have it.
Wow, that is incredible. So Peter, what is this?
This is a stamper battery from the Morning Star gold mine, made in the 1870s, Melbourne, Australia.
So this is the real deal. Wouldn't it be funny if this one actually worked?
Let me show you.
And this is what they used at Bullendale.
The other mines in the area used nearby rivers and streams to drive water wheels which kept their stamping batteries operating consistently. The problem for George Bullen was he was downstream of everyone else and the water wasn't powerful enough to keep the Phoenix mine operating. It really was just a trickle. He needed a new plan.
Enter Fred and James Evans. They convinced George that instead of relying on water wheels, with a bit of ingenuity, a lot of hard yakka, and heaps of cash, he could install an electricity generator over a very steep, high ridge where there was better water flow. The problem was how to get the power from the generator by the better water flow here to the quartz-crushing stamping battery here, almost 3 kilometres away. But if they could do it, they would create New Zealand's first hydropower station.
A guy called Walter Prince from a company called Fletcher & Co. was brought in to assess the viability of the scheme. Now he actually confirmed that what the Evans had suggested was possible, but what he may have neglected to mention to George Bullen was that while it looked easy on paper, in reality it was next to impossible. This was going to be an experiment of epic proportions.
So in 1885, George Bullen spent the equivalent of $1 million today to set up a hydroelectric power station and contracted Fletcher & Co. to make his dream a reality.
So here's a question for you, Dave. The only way into Bullendale these days is by foot, mountain bike, or one of those things. So how on earth did they do it in 1885?
Well, it was only foot or horse, and so that's why this story becomes an epic of monumental proportions.
All the gear required to create George's experiment had to be hauled in by horse. That included 6 tonnes of electrical machine, 3 tonnes of rock crusher, 10 tonnes of casing for the stamping battery, 700 feet of large iron pipe, almost 8 miles of copper wire of 2 different sizes, insulators and poles, winding gear, a pump, rock drills, compressors and pressure vessels, corrugated roofing iron and timber.
So the power plant was built here, quite a long way from Bullendale, by the right branch of Skippers Creek. It was over a 1,000-foot ridgeline called Southberg Spur. Now from an intake up the top of Skippers Creek here, water races were dug all the way around to the top of this cliff. So the water came over the top of this cliff and went into 2 penstocks, which are giant tubes that were attached to the full height of this cliff. The penstocks funneled the water onto these 2 turbines at the back, which in turn spun this intermediate shaft, which then spun these arc dynamos.
And all of this had to be brought in by horse and cart to Skippers, but from Skippers to Bullendale only on horseback. And that's 15 kilometres of very rough road.
Which is pretty impressive, right? I mean, how much do these things weigh?
Well, this frame weighs 1.5 tons, and it had to be slung between 4 horses.
Probably more importantly, we want to ask, what is an arc dynamo with Professor Reeve?
Well, the easy answer is that arc is simply the model name of this machine, and a dynamo is what they call a DC generator. Don't worry about the DC bit, we actually come back to that later. So basically it's a generator. And what happened is there were some coils of copper wire around this middle bit here, And when electricity goes through these coils, they turn into electromagnets. Now this inside bit was spinning around at 750 RPM, and there were coils of copper wire on this piece here, and when you spin these copper coils through here, they generate electricity.
They finally got the plant going in February 1886. Now they had some initial teething problems that took them about a year to work through. And that was pretty impressive in itself, given all the trouble they'd gone to get this stuff in here. But the real magic for George Bullen was that they could take the power from those arc dynamos and send it 3 kilometres over Southburg Spur to Bullendale, where he was busy crushing his quartz in his stamping battery.
So that means by the mid-1880s, George Bullen has built the first hydroelectric power station in the Southern Hemisphere, the first transmission line in the Southern Hemisphere, the first use of electricity for electric motive power in New Zealand, and the first electricity-powered gold stamping battery in the world.
As George became the sole landowner, eventually the Reefs became known as Bullendale, and it was a bustling little town with as many as 190 people living here. Bullen provided half the town with electric street lighting and lit all the mine offices. He also lit the community hall and the schoolhouse, which was one of the first schoolhouses in the world to be lit by electricity.
But by the 1890s, the main gold seam had run its course, and Bullen sold the mine to a British-backed company, and along with some other assets, including a Kaikoura sheep station, he lived out his days in Christchurch as a very rich retiree. So in being the guy who financed the Southern Hemisphere's first hydropower station, I think George Bullen is a very unappreciated Kiwi and deserves to be the first person on our Powerboard of Fame. Pure gold.
Well, you've already alluded to Fred and James Evans, and I think they warrant their own special mention, because it's entirely possible without them, George Bullen wouldn't even have thought of having the world's first electrically powered stamping battery. Fred and James Evans were father and son mining engineers, and by the 1880s, Fred was managing the Phoenix mine for George Bullen. And James had always had an interest in electricity. We're pretty sure it was James Evans who helped convince George Bullen to go electric, and Fred wrote a report about the hydroelectric marvel to the very interested local newspapers. Now Steve mentioned that they had some teething problems when they first started the power station, and they were actually quite serious problems, and it was Fred and James who were the ones that solved them. They got the whole operation running sweetly. Let me explain. So the Phoenix plant was one of the first times in the world that ran 2 DC generators, known as dynamos, together. Usually designs tried to avoid this as the machines would fight each other, which is exactly what happened at Bullendale. The European engineers at the time were just getting their heads around how to fix this problem, but the Evanses sorted it in a canyon in the middle of nowhere in 1887, and they got the whole system running with full power and perfectly reliably. So the Evanses kind of drift off our historical radar at this point. They were mining engineers rather than electrical, but I still think they warrant the mention. So let's put them up on the Powerboard of Fame.
Now the other guy we've mentioned a few times in our Bullendale story is Walter Prince. Now, born and bred in England, he was actually trained as an electrical engineer, and he was working for the Anglo-American Brush Electric Light Corporation. Now, he was brought out to New Zealand to follow a lead that they had that the Lyttelton Harbour Board wanted to investigate electric lighting. Interesting piece of trivia. He arrived on our fair shores on the SS Manapuri, which was the first merchant ship in the world to be fitted throughout with electric light. Another world first for New Zealand. Tick. Ultimately though, the harbour project fell through, and this is where we believe Prince joined Robert Fletcher, more on him later, to form Fletcher & Co. Prince was quite the salesman, and he turned to promoting electricity in colonial New Zealand.
In 1884, he was invited to the Phoenix gold mine at Bullendale. Here, he backed up Fred and James Evans' idea that George Bullen should spend a fortune on what was possibly the most adventurous electrical project in the world.
Unfortunately for Prince, his horse riding skills weren't as good as his salesmanship, and not far from here he was thrown from his horse, hit his head, and had to be evacuated out of Bullendale to Dunedin. They didn't think he would work again.
Unfortunately, Prince and Fletcher ended up going broke and went their separate ways. But by the end of 1886, Prince was on the road again promoting this crazy idea of using hydropower to power electric streetlights in the small mining town of Reefton. But why Reefton? Well, gold of course.
Gold was first discovered in the rivers, in the beds of the rivers, as alluvial, back originally. But it was richer further south, down Kamara, Ross, and them sort of places, rather than around the Nangahua Valley itself. In 1866, the first of the ore reef was found around this area, and this area got the name of Quartzopolis. But the big find was in 1870, so that's when things really took off, and then reef got its name change.
We asked Peter Lawn what the gold meant to Reefton.
Reefton was a very wealthy town. It initially started with alluvial gold, so people made their fortune, then became shopkeepers, hotel keepers, and then they were selling to the workers. Any new something that was invented would be bought here because they wanted to be the first for everything, like the electric light. They just wanted to be the first people to use these things, show the world what they could do.
But you've got to wonder, how did the people of Reefton know they wanted electric light?
The electric light came about in Reefton with the gold miners, really. They were going back and forth from Australia. They found the big gold fields in Bendigo, Ballarat. These guys going back and forth. They went to the big Melbourne exhibition there and saw Edison's lights being shown, these bulbs. Fell in love with them, brought them back to Reefton as they knew the locals would be very interested in seeing the light.
So the good people of Reefton came back from the exhibition pretty excited about Edison's lights. So what was Prince going to do?
He sets up a company selling shares, and he has his hydro generator operational by 1st of August 1888. He successfully demonstrates street lighting to the people of Reefton and signs up 120 customers. Success? Not quite.
The underground cables are insufficiently insulated and he has numerous problems. Under pressure, he abandons his shares and leaves Reefton. An electrician from Greymouth, John Horton, is brought in to get things going. Horton manages the Public Lighting Cooperative, the first in the Southern Hemisphere, and by Christmas 1888, Reefton has 500 lights, both private and public. Fast forward to today, and the hydroelectric scheme which powered Prince's lighting in 1888 still means a lot to the town. We met Greg Topp, the chairman of the Reefton Powerhouse Charitable Trust.
This was the original site of the Reefton Powerhouse, built in 1888, and so it's also got the 1908 unit and I'm standing in the 1935 unit. So we're hoping to restore the whole thing. Well, it's got to be sustainable. So what we want to do is reinstate the buildings as they were, make it an experience that you'll go, wow, and give you the whole history of where it started. But we're going to go further. So we're going to go with a modern plant as well alongside, totally separate to what's here, so we don't detract from this, but in an old looking building of the same era.
I think it's fantastic that 140 years down the track, a small town on the west coast is still celebrating the work of Prince and the other people that made it happen. Because after Reefton, Prince kind of disappears from view and his story sort of makes him out to be a bit of a failure. But I think he does deserve to be up on the Powerboard of Fame. I mean, at the end of the day, all the concepts that he promoted were both practical and ultimately feasible.
Yeah, in those days engineers were also electricians, so it might have actually been the practical work that he struggled with. And don't forget, after his accident at Bullendale, he never got to finish that project and he might have been suffering head trauma for a long time afterwards.
Yeah, so I think his influence on New Zealand is greatly understated. It's not too fine a bow to draw to get a line from Bullendale and Reefton through to every hydroelectric scheme in New Zealand's history. So that's why I think he needs to be up on the Powerboard of Fame.
But he did seem to be a bit camera shy, which is why we were so delighted to make our own discovery at Reefton.
David, can you tell us what we've found here?
We have found the only known photo of Walter Prince.
And this has been extraordinarily hard to find, hasn't it?
It has. We've been researching Bullendale and Reefton for a good few years now. We've read the books, we've consulted historians, we've looked for the photos. As far as everyone told us, there was no known photo of Walter Prince.
And it's amazing to think that given he was a salesman, travelling salesman, and he championed the cause of electricity in its early days all around the country, and yet we have to come to Reefton on the side of a mock water wheel to find a photograph of him.
It's right, and Walter, it's good to finally meet you.
I think he was a great engineer, a great visionary, and that's why he deserves to be up on the Powerboard of Fame.
So Dave and I found the pioneers that started New Zealand's love affair with hydro. These guys got us off to a flying start internationally, not only in this new thing called electricity, but also the pursuit of renewables. But there was about to be a fundamental change to who would now champion water for power, a change that would last almost 100 years. We'll look at that next time on Powering New Zealand.